In the dust-choked dawn of 1887, two figures stood silhouetted against the gallows in Redemption Creek, Wyoming territory. The crowd had gathered before sunrise, their faces hard as the rocky terrain that surrounded this godforsaken mining town. But what they were about to witness would shake the very foundations of frontier justice and expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of power. Young Tommy Morrison, barely 16, trembled as the rough hemp rope scraped against his neck. Beside him, his childhood friend Billy Henderson, just 15, closed his eyes and whispered what he believed would be his final prayer. The charges against them were as serious as they came in the Old West: cattle rustling and the murder of wealthy rancher Samuel Blackwood. The evidence seemed ironclad, the verdict swift, and the sentence absolute: death by hanging at dawn. But standing in the shadows of the crowd was a man whose weathered hands would soon change everything. Ezra McAllister had seen enough injustice in his 63 years to recognize it when it stared him in the face. As the town's former sheriff turned cattle rancher, he possessed something the mob lacked: patience and an eye for detail that had kept him alive through 3 decades of frontier law enforcement. The story began 3 weeks earlier when Samuel Blackwood's prized Angus cattle started disappearing from his sprawling ranch just outside Redemption Creek. Blackwood, a man whose wealth and influence had grown considerably since striking silver in the nearby mountains, was not one to suffer losses quietly. His hired hands reported seeing 2 young figures on horseback near the grazing areas on multiple occasions, and when pressed by Blackwood's intimidating foreman, Jake Torino, several reluctant witnesses identified Tommy and Billy as the culprits. The accusations might have remained in the realm of civil dispute had it not been for the gruesome discovery made on a cold October morning. Samuel Blackwood was found dead in his study, a bullet wound to the chest and his safe standing wide open. The town marshal, a nervous man named Deputy Collins who had assumed the role after the previous sheriff's mysterious departure, quickly formed a posse. Within hours, they had tracked down the 2 boys camping by Miller's Creek, nearly 20 miles from town. What sealed their fate in the eyes of the law was the discovery of Blackwood's distinctive silver pocket watch in Billy's saddlebag, along with nearly $200 in cash. The boys protested their innocence with tears streaming down their faces, claiming they had found the items while fishing and had no idea who they belonged to. Their story fell on deaf ears. Judge Harrison Caldwell, newly appointed to the territorial court, wasted little time in pronouncing them guilty after a trial that lasted barely 3 hours. But Ezra McAllister had been watching, listening, and remembering things that others seemed eager to forget. He recalled how Samuel Blackwood had been acting strangely in the weeks before his death, frequently traveling to the territorial capital and meeting with men in expensive suits who looked distinctly out of place in a frontier mining town. He remembered the heated arguments Blackwood had been having with his business partner, Marcus Thornfield, over the expansion of their silver mining operation onto land that belonged to several local ranchers. Most importantly, McAllister remembered something that nobody else seemed willing to acknowledge. Jake Torino had been asking questions around town about the 2 boys weeks before the cattle started disappearing, inquiring about their families, their habits, and where they liked to spend their time. As the executioner prepared to pull the lever that would drop the platform beneath the boys' feet, McAllister noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the crowd, partially hidden behind the general store, stood Jake Torino with a satisfied smirk on his scarred face. But what caught McAllister's attention was not the foreman's presence. It was the distinctive silver watch chain hanging from his vest pocket, identical to the one that had allegedly sealed the boy's fate. The realization hit McAllister like a lightning bolt. He had seen that watch chain before, dangling from Samuel Blackwood's vest during their last conversation at the Miners' Saloon. Blackwood had been proud of that watch, a family heirloom passed down from his father, and he had mentioned having a second chain made by the town jeweler because the original was wearing thin. Without hesitation, McAllister pushed through the crowd, his weathered hands reaching for the Colt revolver at his hip. The executioner's hand was already moving toward the lever when McAllister's voice boomed across the square like thunder. "Stop this execution! These boys are innocent." The crowd turned in confusion and anger. Judge Caldwell, red-faced and indignant, demanded to know the meaning of this interruption. McAllister ignored the judge and kept his eyes fixed on Jake Torino, who had gone pale and was slowly backing away from the crowd. "Jake Torino," McAllister called out, his voice carrying the authority of his years in law enforcement. "Why don't you show everyone that silver watch chain you're wearing?" Torino's hand instinctively moved to his vest, and in that moment of panic, he made a fatal mistake. Instead of standing his ground, he turned and ran. The crowd's attention shifted immediately, and several men began pursuing the fleeing foreman. But McAllister was already moving, his long strides carrying him around the building where he knew Torino would emerge. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Cornered in the alley behind Murphy's feed store, Torino drew his gun but found himself staring down the barrel of McAllister's Colt. The former sheriff's draw was still lightning fast despite his age, and Torino wisely dropped his weapon. Under McAllister's intense questioning, and faced with the evidence of the watch chain, Torino's carefully constructed story began to unravel like a cheap rope. The truth that emerged was more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Samuel Blackwood had discovered that his silver mine was sitting on top of one of the richest veins in the territory, worth potentially millions of dollars. But there was a problem. To access the full extent of the deposit, they would need to expand onto neighboring ranches, including land owned by the Morrison and Henderson families. Blackwood had initially tried to buy the land legitimately, but both families had refused his generous offers. The Morrison ranch had been in Tommy's family for 3 generations, and the Hendersons had worked their small spread for over a decade. When legal means failed, Blackwood had turned to more desperate measures. Marcus Thornfield, Blackwood's business partner, had brought in Jake Torino with specific instructions to drive out the smaller ranchers by any means necessary. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Frame the ranchers' sons for cattle rustling, force the families into financial ruin through legal fees and lost livestock, then swoop in to buy the land for a fraction of its true value. But Samuel Blackwood had developed a conscience. In the days before his death, he had been meeting with territorial officials to confess the scheme and make restitution to the affected families. Jake Torino, acting on orders from Marcus Thornfield, had murdered his own employer to prevent the truth from coming to light. The silver watch found in Billy's saddlebag was indeed Blackwood's, but it had been planted there by Torino after the murder. The cash was money that Blackwood had withdrawn to compensate the families, money that Torino had stolen along with the watch. The boys had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, making them perfect scapegoats for a crime they knew nothing about. As Torino confessed under the growing pressure of evidence and the angry stares of the townspeople, McAllister couldn't help but reflect on how close they had come to executing 2 innocent children. The rope still hung around their necks as he spoke, a grim reminder of how quickly frontier justice could become frontier injustice. The revelation sent shockwaves through Redemption Creek. Judge Caldwell, who had been so eager to pronounce sentence, now found himself facing questions about his hastiness and his relationship with Marcus Thornfield. Deputy Collins, overwhelmed by the complexity of the case, quietly resigned his position and left town within the week. But the story was far from over. Marcus Thornfield, upon learning of Torino's capture and confession, attempted to flee the territory with whatever assets he could liquidate quickly. McAllister, now acting as temporary sheriff at the community's request, organized a posse that tracked Thornfield to a way station near the Colorado border. The final confrontation took place in a snowstorm that had blown in from the mountains, turning the world into a white wilderness where visibility extended barely 20 yards. Thornfield, desperate and cornered, made his last stand in an abandoned cabin that had once served travelers on the Denver Road. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted through the night. Thornfield had supplies and ammunition, but McAllister had patience and the moral certainty that comes from fighting for justice. As dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape, Thornfield finally emerged with his hands raised, his spirit broken by the isolation and the weight of his crimes. The trial that followed was unlike anything Redemption Creek had ever witnessed. Territorial Judge William Hartley, a man with an impeccable reputation for fairness, presided over proceedings that lasted nearly 2 weeks. The evidence against Thornfield and the deceased Torino was overwhelming, but Judge Hartley insisted on hearing every detail to ensure that no stone was left unturned. Tommy Morrison and Billy Henderson, who had spent 3 weeks in jail awaiting execution for crimes they didn't commit, were called as witnesses in their own defense. Their testimony, delivered with the courage that comes from surviving injustice, moved many in the courtroom to tears. The boys described their terror during those final moments on the gallows, the prayers they had whispered, and their gratitude to McAllister for believing in their innocence when no one else would. The Morrison and Henderson families, who had watched their sons come within moments of death, testified about the attempts to buy their land and the increasing pressure they had felt from Blackwood's representatives. Other ranchers came forward with similar stories, painting a picture of a systematic campaign of intimidation and fraud. Dr. Patricia Williamson, one of the few women physicians in the territory, provided crucial medical testimony about Samuel Blackwood's death. Her examination of the body had revealed details that the hasty initial investigation had missed. The angle of the bullet wound suggested that the killer had been someone Blackwood trusted, someone he had allowed to get close enough for a point-blank shot. The jeweler who had made Blackwood's second watch chain confirmed McAllister's story, producing his records to show that only 2 such chains had ever been crafted. The bank president testified about Blackwood's large cash withdrawal in the days before his death, money that was supposedly intended for compensation payments but had ended up in the hands of the accused cattle rustlers. As the evidence mounted, Marcus Thornfield's defense crumbled. His expensive lawyer, brought in from Denver, could do little more than argue for leniency based on his client's previously clean record and standing in the business community. But the jury, composed of local ranchers and townspeople who understood the value of honesty and hard work, was not impressed by appeals to class privilege. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, fraud, and conspiracy to commit rustling. Judge Hartley sentenced Marcus Thornfield to life imprisonment at the Territorial Penitentiary, noting that while he had not pulled the trigger himself, his actions had orchestrated a campaign of terror that had nearly claimed the lives of 2 innocent children. In an unusual move, Judge Hartley also issued formal apologies to the Morrison and Henderson families, acknowledging that the territorial justice system had failed them catastrophically. He ordered that restitution be paid from Thornfield's seized assets and established a fund to compensate other ranchers who had been victims of the conspiracy. The aftermath of the trial brought significant changes to Redemption Creek. Ezra McAllister was formally appointed as the new sheriff, a position he accepted reluctantly but with a deep sense of duty. His first act was to establish new protocols for criminal investigations, ensuring that evidence would be carefully preserved and witnesses thoroughly questioned before charges were filed. The silver mine that had been at the center of the conspiracy was placed under territorial administration pending resolution of the various legal claims against Blackwood's estate. Eventually, a portion of the profits would be distributed to the families who had been targeted by Thornfield's scheme, providing them with the financial security they needed to maintain their ranches. Tommy Morrison and Billy Henderson, who had faced death with remarkable courage for boys their age, became symbols of resilience in the face of injustice. Their story spread throughout the territory, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of rushing to judgment and the importance of standing up for truth, even when it's unpopular. The boys themselves handled their ordeal with a maturity that impressed everyone who knew them. Rather than becoming bitter or fearful, they threw themselves into their work on their families' ranches and became advocates for fair treatment of all accused persons. Tommy eventually studied law and became a defense attorney, while Billy followed in McAllister's footsteps and joined law enforcement. Years later, when both men were established in their careers, they would often speak about those terrifying moments on the gallows and how McAllister's intervention had given them not just their lives back, but their faith in justice. They credited the experience with shaping their commitment to ensuring that no other innocent person would suffer as they had. McAllister himself lived to see Redemption Creek transform from a rough mining town into a thriving community built on principles of fairness and mutual respect. He served as sheriff for 15 more years, establishing a reputation for thorough investigation and impartial law enforcement that attracted settlers who valued stability and justice. The old gallows where Tommy and Billy had nearly died was torn down within months of the trial's conclusion. In its place, the community erected a memorial to victims of injustice, inscribed with the words, "Truth may be delayed, but it will not be denied." The memorial served as a constant reminder that the price of justice is eternal vigilance and the courage to act when others remain silent. The silver mine eventually became one of the most productive in the territory, but its profits were shared more equitably among the community members who had suffered during Thornfield's campaign of terror. The Morrison and Henderson ranches not only survived but prospered. Their land values increased by the discovery of mineral wealth beneath their grazing areas. As for McAllister, he often reflected on how a moment of observation and moral courage had prevented a terrible miscarriage of justice. He understood that in the rough-and-tumble world of the American frontier, the difference between civilization and chaos often came down to individuals willing to stand up for what was right, even when it was dangerous or unpopular to do so. The story of Redemption Creek became legendary throughout the Wyoming Territory and beyond, a tale that embodied both the worst and best impulses of frontier society. It showed how quickly fear and prejudice could lead to tragedy, but also how individual courage and integrity could triumph over corruption and conspiracy. In the end, the two boys who had stood on the gallows that October morning had received something more valuable than their lives. They had been given proof that justice, though sometimes delayed and imperfect, could still prevail when good people refused to stand by and watch evil triumph. The rope that had been cut from their necks became a symbol of deliverance, but more importantly, it represented the thin line that separates justice from vengeance, truth from assumption, and courage from complacency in the ongoing struggle to build a society worthy of the human spirit. The years that followed the Redemption Creek incident would prove that justice, once properly served, has a way of rippling outward like stones thrown into still water. Sheriff Ezra McAllister, now in his 70s, found himself becoming something of a legend throughout the Wyoming Territory. Lawmen from neighboring counties would ride for days just to seek his counsel on difficult cases, and his methodical approach to investigation became the standard by which frontier justice was measured. Tommy Morrison, true to his word, had indeed pursued the study of law. By 1895, he had established a practice in Cheyenne that specialized in defending those who couldn't afford representation. His office walls were decorated not with the typical certificates and awards, but with letters from clients whose lives he had saved from wrongful conviction. He never forgot the terror of standing on those gallows, and every case he took was fought with the passion of someone who understood that the difference between guilt and innocence could be measured in seconds. Billy Henderson had followed a different path, but one no less meaningful. After serving as McAllister's deputy for several years, he had been elected sheriff of the neighboring county. His reputation for fairness and thorough investigation had spread throughout the region, and crime rates in his jurisdiction had dropped to levels unheard of in frontier territories. He married Sarah Collins, the daughter of the former deputy who had resigned in shame after the near execution, and together they raised 4 children who would grow up knowing that their father had once faced death for a crime he didn't commit. The transformation of Redemption Creek itself stood as perhaps the most visible testament to the power of truth over corruption. What had once been a rough mining town where might made right had evolved into a model community that attracted families seeking opportunity in an environment governed by law rather than violence. The main street, once dominated by saloons and gambling halls, now boasted a schoolhouse, a library, and a church whose bell tower could be seen for miles across the prairie. McAllister often walked those streets in the early morning hours, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the community he had helped shape through decades of principled leadership. The general store where Jake Torino had once hidden in the shadows was now run by the widow of one of the ranchers who had been targeted by Thornfield's conspiracy. The Miners' Saloon, where Samuel Blackwood had spent his final evening, had been converted into a meeting hall where the town council gathered monthly to discuss community improvements. But it was the small details that spoke most powerfully to the lasting impact of that October morning in 1887. The Henderson Ranch, once threatened with foreclosure due to legal fees and lost livestock, had become one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the territory. The Morrison spread, similarly recovered, was now managed by Tommy's younger brother, who had learned from his family's near tragedy the importance of standing firm against those who would use wealth and influence to trample on the rights of honest working people. The memorial that had replaced the gallows had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for those throughout the territory who had suffered injustice. Families would travel hundreds of miles to stand before the simple stone monument, drawing strength from the knowledge that truth could prevail even in the darkest circumstances. The inscription, "Truth may be delayed, but it will not be denied," had been copied onto monuments in dozens of other communities, each serving as a reminder that vigilance against injustice was the price of maintaining a civilized society. In the winter of 1902, McAllister received a letter that would bring the story full circle in a way that surprised even him. The envelope bore the official seal of the Wyoming Territorial Government, and inside was an offer that would have seemed impossible 15 years earlier. The territorial governor, citing McAllister's exemplary service and his role in establishing new standards for criminal investigation, was offering him the position of territorial marshal, the highest law enforcement position in the region. McAllister read the letter twice before walking to the window of his office, looking out at the bustling main street of Redemption Creek. At 78, he was still sharp and capable, but he understood that his greatest contribution to justice might not be in taking on new responsibilities, but in ensuring that the lessons learned in his community were passed on to the next generation of lawmen. He declined the appointment but made a counteroffer that the governor readily accepted. McAllister would establish a training program for sheriffs and deputies throughout the territory, teaching the investigative methods and ethical principles that had transformed Redemption Creek from a lawless mining camp into a beacon of frontier justice. The program would be based in Redemption Creek, drawing students from across the West who wanted to learn how to serve their communities with integrity and competence. The first class of the McAllister Institute for Frontier Law Enforcement graduated in the spring of 1903. Among the 24 students were 3 women, a revolutionary development in frontier law enforcement that reflected McAllister's belief that justice required diverse perspectives and that courage and integrity were not limited by gender. 2 of the graduates were sons of ranchers who had been victims of the Thornfield Conspiracy, young men who had grown up understanding that the law could be either a tool of oppression or a shield for the innocent, depending on those who wielded it. Tommy Morrison served as the Institute's legal instructor, teaching students how to gather evidence that would stand up in court and how to work with attorneys to ensure that cases were properly prosecuted. His lectures on the presumption of innocence were legendary, often beginning with his own story of standing on the gallows and ending with detailed analysis of how hasty judgments and prejudice could lead to irreversible tragedies. Billy Henderson taught courses on investigation techniques, using actual cases from his years in law enforcement to demonstrate how careful observation and methodical questioning could uncover truth hidden beneath layers of deception and misdirection. His students learned to look beyond the obvious suspects and to follow evidence wherever it led, even when it challenged popular assumptions or implicated powerful individuals. The Institute's influence spread far beyond the boundaries of Wyoming Territory. Graduates carried McAllister's methods to law enforcement agencies throughout the American West, and many of the investigative techniques developed in Redemption Creek would eventually be adopted by police departments in major cities. The emphasis on thorough investigation before arrest, careful preservation of evidence, and protection of suspects' rights would become fundamental principles of modern law enforcement. As McAllister entered his final years, he often reflected on the chain of events that had begun with 2 frightened boys on a gallows and evolved into a movement that had touched thousands of lives. The near execution of Tommy Morrison and Billy Henderson had been prevented by a single moment of moral courage, but the ripple effects of that moment continued to expand decades later. In the spring of 1905, McAllister received visitors who brought the story to its emotional conclusion. Tommy Morrison, now a successful attorney and father of 3, arrived in Redemption Creek accompanied by Billy Henderson, whose own family had grown to include 5 children. They came not as former victims seeking closure, but as successful men wanting to honor the person who had given them the opportunity to become who they were meant to be. The 3 men walked together to the memorial that stood where the gallows had once cast its shadow over the town square. McAllister, now 81 and moving more slowly than in his prime, leaned heavily on a walking stick as they approached the stone monument. The inscription had weathered somewhat over the years, but the words remained clear and powerful. Truth may be delayed, but it will not be denied. Tommy Morrison placed his hand on the stone and spoke words that would be remembered long after all 3 men had passed into history. This monument doesn't just commemorate what happened here that day. It stands for the principle that every person deserves justice, that every accused individual deserves someone willing to fight for the truth, and that civilization itself depends on people like Ezra McAllister, who have the courage to act when others remain silent. Billy Henderson added his own thoughts, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades in law enforcement. What we learned that day wasn't just about our own survival. We learned that injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere, and that the price of freedom is the willingness of good people to stand up against corruption and cruelty, even when it's dangerous to do so. McAllister listened to their words with the satisfaction of a man who had lived to see his life's work validated by its results. The 2 boys who had trembled on the gallows had become men of integrity and accomplishment, leaders in their communities who understood that their survival carried with it an obligation to protect others who might face similar threats. The old sheriff's final years were spent in quiet contentment, watching as new generations of lawmen graduated from his institute and took their places in communities throughout the expanding American West. He lived to see Wyoming achieve statehood in 1890, and he took pride in knowing that the principles established in Redemption Creek had helped shape the legal foundations of the new state. When Ezra McAllister died peacefully in his sleep in January 1908, the entire territory mourned the loss of a man who had embodied the best ideals of frontier justice. His funeral drew hundreds of people from across the region, including many whose lives had been touched by his commitment to truth and fairness. Tommy Morrison and Billy Henderson served as pallbearers, carrying the man who had saved their lives to his final resting place in the Redemption Creek Cemetery. The legacy of that October morning in 1887 lived on in ways both large and small. The McAllister Institute continued to train law enforcement officers according to the principles its founder had established, and its graduates carried those principles to communities throughout the American West and beyond. The memorial in Redemption Creek's town square remained a powerful symbol of the triumph of justice over corruption, drawing visitors who sought inspiration in their own struggles against injustice. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy was found in the simple fact that 2 innocent boys had grown to become men who dedicated their lives to ensuring that others would not face the terror they had experienced. Their survival had been secured by one man's courage, but their response to that gift had multiplied its impact exponentially, creating a chain of justice that would extend far into the future. The rope that had been cut from their necks that dawn morning had long since crumbled to dust, but the principle it represented endured, that in the darkest moments, when injustice seems certain to triumph, there remains the possibility that one person with courage and conviction can change everything. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of Redemption Creek, that heroes are not born but made, forged in moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things because it is right regardless of the personal cost.